If you grew up in the 70s or the 80s, chances are that at one point you had one of these on your bookshelf. This is Back to the Future, this is E.T., this is Star Trek. Here's one more for you. This is Jaws. And the other three books have something in common that this one does not. Author Peter Benchley published Jaws in 1974 and admitted that he honestly didn't see much potential in the book. As Benchley put it, it was a first novel, and nobody reads first novels. It was a first novel about a fish, so who cares? It was a case of writing what you know for Benchley, who grew up fishing with his father in Nantucket. In 1971, Benchley pitched a story about a man-eating shark to Doubleday editor Thomas Congdon, who helped him develop the idea and eventually greenlit the project for the publisher with a $7,500 advance for Benchley. While Benchley may not have had much hope for the book, Congdon submitted the book to the Book of the Month Club that turned it into one of their selections, and he also managed to get the book picked up by Reader's Digest. Before it was even in print, the novel would catch the eye of director Steven Spielberg and producers Richard D. Zanuck and David Brown, who snapped up the rights for a film adaptation for $150,000 and an additional $25,000 to Benchley to write the screenplay. Then the three pre-ordered 100 copies of the novel each that they gave out to what they called the Hollywood Chattering Set on the day of its release, helping to boost the book's sales in California and making it literally overnight the best-selling book in the state. And it didn't perform too bad elsewhere either. It stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for 44 weeks, peaking at number 2, just behind Richard Adams's Watership Down. By the time the film adaptation released, 5.5 million copies of the book had been sold, and the film would quickly become the highest-grossing film in the history of the industry. It would hold that record until the 1977 release of George Lucas's Star Wars. This is not an unusual path for a book to take in Hollywood. Well, okay, the success is a little bit unusual, but not the actual path the book took to the screen. But the other three books that I mentioned came from a very different world, a world where the movie comes first and the novel comes second. This is the story of the original home videos, the movie novelization. Le Vampyres, Louis Feuillot's serial crime film released between 1915 and 1916, was his follow-up to his previous success, Fantomas. Fantomas had been released for Pathé, while for Les Vampires, Feuillot had partnered with Pathé's rival studio Gaumont. Additionally, Fantomas had been an adaptation from a series of popular novels by Marcel Alain and Pierre Souvestre. The 7-hour film, still one of the longest mainstream movies ever made, was divided into 10 episodes, and while critics raked it over the coals for what they felt were its immoral themes and for its relative lack of experimentation for the time, audiences loved it. Even World War I couldn't stop French audiences from devouring the series as it was released, and the studio would dabble in taking the movies into people's homes by licensing a 7-volume book adaptation to pulp publishers. The adaptation would be written by Feuillot and Georges Mér, and began publication in 1916 as the film serials were wrapping up their release to theaters. Le Vampire would not be the only such adaptation. In fact, novelizations became a staple of the cinema from the days of the silence. Sometimes the novels would even wind up outliving the movies. 1927's London After Midnight from MGM received a paperback novelization written by Marie Coolidge Rask. You can still find that novel today, although the film it was based on has long since been lost. Novelizations began as the first real attempt at allowing audiences to take the movies home. Even back in the earliest days of the industry, most movies were never sold even to theaters, but rather leased. The prints always belonged to the distributor, and many of the early distributors would actually destroy prints, both to save on archive space and to prevent the more successful of their movies from falling into the hands of bootleggers. As detailed in Michael Binder's A Light Affliction, early attempts at archiving films were frequently stymied by this industrial standard, and many collections were afraid to publish their catalogs or even promote their screenings, for fear that film studios would claim ownership and send someone to reclaim the prints and take them back for destruction. That's not to say that there was no way to bring movies, real movies, into the home. The first home projectors were sold in 1912 from Edison and Pathé, but even they would not sell the movies themselves directly to home collectors. Instead, they would rent the movies out by mail. Yes, just under a century before Netflix filled the mail with the now lamented red envelopes, Edison and Pathé were shipping sets of film reels to a specialist market of home film hobbyists. The program only lasted for 2 years with Edison, and Pathé would wind up ending their program sometime during World War I. With the 1924 development of 16mm film by Kodak and their later 8mm format, studios finally started offering films for sale to home projector owners. But the vast majority of them weren't really the movie itself. Instead, they were, for the most part, highlight reels, splicing together some of the most popular and beloved moments of the movie. Some full movies found their way onto home 16mm legitimately, but for the most part, the studios kept a tight leash on complete films, leaving the market open for bootleggers. And the original 8mm reels that the studios sold to the public were rarely any longer than 10 minutes. Even if you were willing to take the movies home in such a way, projectors were expensive. They were finicky to thread. The film had to be stored properly and occasionally repaired, and the projectors had to be maintained. No, the cheapest, easiest, and most widely loved way to bring the movies home for close to 2/3 of a century was the novelization. With the right writer, the 20,000 words of a screenplay could become the 60,000 words of a best-selling novel, as happened to the first ever novelization of a sound film, King Kong, in which Dallas W. Loveless adapted James Creelman's and Ruth Rose's screenplay. Not content with just one adaptation, RKO would also license Mystery Magazine to serialize an adaptation that would be written by Walter F. Ripperger. At the time, the adaptation sold cheap to audiences who wanted to bring the big ape home. But currently, a first edition of Loveless's King Kong novelization is valued at around $1,800, and that is in library discard condition. Novelizations became so popular, in fact, that by the time that King Kong novel was heading to printers, studios were already thinking of the book as being not just a way to sell the audience the experience of taking the movie home, but also a profitable way for studios to promote the film. The vast majority of movie novelizations throughout the decades have actually hit the shelves just slightly in advance of the movie's release. Not early enough to spoil the movie-going experience for most of the audience, but with enough lead time that you'll see the book around as the movie is hitting the theaters. Meanwhile, book publishers see the movie and the full court press of promotion from the studios as advertising for their novelization. The heyday of the movie novelization was, absolutely, the era prior to the popularization and the falling prices of VHS in the 1980s. But novelizations have stuck around. 2014's novelization of Godzilla managed to hit the New York Times bestseller list, and publishing industry estimates suggest that if you publish a novelization, it will be bought, on average, by 1 to 2% of the audience that watched the movie. A successful movie means a successful book, and vice versa.
Hi, Bob Executive. Which way is business?
Often, people who read novelizations will say that they enjoy getting to spend more time with the stories and the characters from their favorite movies. With more room in the manuscript, many people who have written novelizations over the years have chosen to expand on the original movie with added insight into the characters, their motivations, and their internal monologues. Other times, the book can feel more expansive than the movie because of the simple mechanics of getting the novel ready to release before the film, as was the case with the now infamous Back to the Future novelization. Novelizers often find themselves working from screenplays instead of from the finished film, and, depending on the timing, may even work from an earlier draft of the screenplay than the one that ultimately gets filmed. And then there's the rare occasion when a novelizer is simply turned loose with their adaptation and allowed to add and subtract as they see fit. But probably the most interesting change to happen in a novelization is when the original filmmaker gets the opportunity to use the book to revisit their original film.
What religion can they possibly be learning? Jumping over bonfires.
Parthenogenesis.
What?
Literally, as Miss Rose would doubtless say in her assiduous way, reproduction without sexual union.
Oh, what is all this?
In 1971, Dracula Countdown alumnus Christopher Lee met with screenwriter Anthony Shaffer to discuss ways to break from Lee's traditional Gothic horror villain roles and create roles that were more nuanced and unusual. Shaffer would later read the novel Ritual by David Pinner about a Christian police officer who investigates strange goings-on in a small rural community where pagan rituals are still performed. Shaffer shared the story with Lee, and the two together paid David Pinner £15,000 for the rights to adapt his novel. But wait, this is sounding more like the novel-to-film pipeline than a novelization, isn't it? Well, yes, except that before too long, Shaffer decided that he wasn't actually interested in doing a direct adaptation of Pinner's novel to the screen. He wound up keeping only a couple of scenes from the novel, but proceeded to rewrite the entire story from the ground up with original characters and original situations. In 1973, the project would debut on the screen. Directed by Robin Hardy, The Wicker Man would go on to become a cult classic and is still considered a masterpiece of strange cinema, the American remake featuring Nicolas Cage notwithstanding. In the process of making its way from production to premiere, however, it lost a lot of its runtime. EMI and British Lion, who handled the film in the UK, asked Hardy to cut 20 minutes from his original cut. Meanwhile, Roger Corman screened a 99-minute cut of the film and suggested about 13 minutes worth of cuts for the American market. The finished cut would hit theaters with a total runtime of 87 minutes, and Christopher Lee would always insist that the edits had introduced glaring continuity errors. But now the movie had drifted very far afield from David Pinner's Ritual, so much so that reading the book feels completely different from watching the movie, and so Hardy decided that since The Wicker Man was effectively an original film, it deserved a novelization. Hardy would claim that he started writing the novelization before Schaeffer had even finished the screenplay, and in 1978, initial printings would credit Hardy and Schaeffer as co-authors. While Hardy was the only writer to actually touch the manuscript for the novel, much of the dialogue in the book was lifted directly from the screenplay. And in addition to restoring scenes that were cut, he took the opportunity to do something very interesting. The novelization of The Wicker Man includes entire characters and subplots not seen in any released edition of the movie, and reportedly not even seen in Hardy's original director's cut. In fact, it contains scenes that were reportedly never even in the screenplay, that Hardy and Schaeffer had discussed including in the movie, but that ultimately they had abandoned as being too expensive or adding too much to the runtime before the scenes even found their way onto the page, let alone onto film, making the 1978 novelization of The Wicker Man a more complete version of the story than even Hardy's original cut.
Oh, no.
Ah, 007.
What a wonderful surprise.
Well, for me, too. I must say, I find this business of equipping you in the field, on the run, as it were, highly irregular.
Some novelizations go even farther than Hardy's The Wicker Man when it comes to restoring lost media. There is a small but significant subset of novelizations that are commonly referred to as orphaned novelizations. These books represent a screenplay that was written but that never actually made it onto film. In 1961, Ian Fleming would publish Thunderball, the 8th full-length James Bond novel. This came a full year before Eon Productions' Dr. No hit theaters, launching Bond as a film franchise. But in 1958, Fleming and writing partners including Kevin McClory would write and try to sell a screenplay based on the character. In fact, according to multiple sources, the group produced 10 outlines, treatments, and completed scripts. When the screenplay failed to sell, however, Fleming retooled the story into Thunderball, and its publication with Fleming listed as the sole author would lead to a major court case. In the end, Fleming retained the rights to the novel, while McClory got the screen adaptation rights. When Eon Productions later wanted to adapt the novel in 1965, they would do so through a special arrangement with McClory, and Fleming's disgruntled co-writer would later resell those rights for the film Never Say Never Again, a non-Eon produced Bond film that directly competed with 1983's official Bond release, Octopussy. But if you really want something to bake your noodle, consider this. I mentioned Robin Hardy novelized The Wicker Man because the movie had strayed too far from its source material, David Pinner's Ritual. But Ritual itself was an orphaned adaptation, as Pinner had previously attempted to sell the story in screenplay form unsuccessfully. So 1978's The Wicker Man is a novelization of a 1973 movie that was very loosely based on a novel that was itself an orphaned adaptation of a movie that had never been made.
Oh, what is all this?
Of course, movies are not alone in being novelized. Stage plays were less often adapted, but I would be remiss if I didn't point out that J.M. Barrie's 1911 Peter and Wendy was in fact a novel adaptation of his earlier stage version of Peter Pan, and not the other way around. And television-based novels have long had a role in expanding their franchise's world beyond the small screen, with Star Trek, Doctor Who, and Monk being among the most popular. And while they are far less common than their film and television brethren, novelizations of video games have appeared on bookstore shelves since 1984, when Warner Books published Shadowkeep, Alan Dean Foster's novelization of the Apple II interactive fiction game. In addition to Shadowkeep and a plethora of original stories, Foster would also write novelizations and tie-ins for Star Trek, Star Wars, Alien, Terminator, Transformers, The Last Starfighter, The Clash of the Titans, The Chronicles of Riddick. Look, if it was big money in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, Foster probably had his hand in the novelization somewhere. Thanks for checking out the video. What was your favorite ever movie novelization? Mine was probably Wayland Drew's adaptation of 1988's Willow. Drop down into the comments and let me know what movie, if any, you just couldn't wait to take home in paper form. While you're down there, be sure to take a look at the like and subscribe button and give them a click if you haven't already. Also, you can give that bell a ring to make certain that you get notified every time this channel updates, which is on Fridays-ish. Thanks to our patrons for helping make the channel better. If you're in a financial position to help the channel grow, you can find links to the Ko-fi and Patreon down below, as well as some bookshop affiliate links for relevant texts, and the occasional Amazon link for the movies. If you aren't in such a position, then know that I thank you for watching, and I hope you'll stick around for more videos. Sharing the video with your friends helps immensely, and after all, sharing is caring. Until next time, watch like it means something.